Welcome back to Notorious Minds, and if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel. Please remember to click the notification bell. In that way, you will be notified the next time I upload a new video. When I say the words necrophiliac, sexual sadist, narcissist, child killer, these are just a few words to describe the man we're talking about today. We are diving deep into the chilling life of one of the world's most notorious serial killers, Theodore Robert Bundy, but the world would come to know him as Ted Bundy. This individual would change the way police agencies investigated crimes. It's been 50 years since he came on the scene. We are uncovering shocking details most people miss, from his creepy childhood and his twisted psychology that drove his heinous acts. We are leaving no stone unturned. Take a trip through the dark psyche that was Ted Bundy. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on a brisk Sunday on November 24, 1946. Just 4 days shy of the Thanksgiving holiday in Burlington, Vermont. Now, Theodore was born out of wedlock to a single mother. Her name was Now, when we get to Ted's mother, it starts to become a little complicated, so bear with me. Eleanor Louise Bundy was born on September 21, 1924 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and she worked as a secretary at the University of Puget Sound in the mid-1970s. She was a regular church attendee at the First United Methodist Church in Tacoma, Washington. His mother was the eldest of 3 daughters. Then suddenly, in November of 1946, Eleanor discovered that she was pregnant. At 6 months pregnant, when Eleanor could no longer hide her pregnancy from prying eyes, Eleanor's parents sent her away. During this time, it was a shame for a woman to have a child out of wedlock. They sent her to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. It was a large Victorian-style house previously known as the Home of Friendless Women, but eventually became the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. The home was renamed after a tireless supporter named Elizabeth Lund, the wife of an eminent doctor, who gave $100,000 to the Lund home. That was an exceptional amount of money considering this was the 1940s. When the young girls came to the home, they could pick up a wedding ring out of a bowl near the entrance to the home, so that when they went out in public, people wouldn't stare at them. Rarely did these young women keep their babies. When the women at the home went to the hospital to have their babies, they used the last name of Lund as their last name. From 1945 to 1973, single mothers in the United States gave birth in an era of secrecy and shame that historians of the adoption age call the baby scoop era. During this time, millions of unwed mothers gave birth to children who they often unwillingly relinquished for adoption. Most importantly, they were expected to wait until marriage to have children. You would probably be shocked to find out that psychiatrists during this time diagnosed out-of-wedlock births as tangible evidence of social deviance. Yes, I said a deviant. Psychiatrists pointed to illegitimate births as signs of a mother's psychological neurosis. But what about the father? They characterize unwed mothers as women with psychiatric problems and as victims of severe emotional and mental disturbance. Yes, a large majority right now would be considered mentally disturbed. Now, young Eleanor gave birth to Theodore Robert Bundy at the age of 22 years old, following her stay of 3 months at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Vermont. Shortly after his birth, Theodore and his mother moved back home with his grandparents in Philadelphia. While growing up, young Theodore was led to believe that his grandparents were his parents and that his biological mother was his older sister. This charade was created in order to protect his biological mother from harsh criticism and prejudice of being an unwed mother. But one thing that is interesting about Ted Bundy is this. During Louise's stay at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, Children were referred to only as numbers instead of names. Mothers also had to pay fees, 2 payments of $150 each for adoption services, and $4.50 for probate fees, and $1 to the city clerk for a certified copy of the birth certificate. This birth certificate was amended. It was an amended birth certificate, one that renamed the characters involved in the child's conception, meaning the parents. The names on the birth certificates were altered. The original birth certificate was retained permanently and sealed, according to state regulations, for 99 years after the date of the birth of the young child. So his birth certificate was altered. So if anybody went to see his birth certificate later in life, namely Ted, his birth certificate would have been altered. He would not have seen his true father's name on that birth certificate. Vermont law requires original birth certificates of adopted children to be sealed for 99 years and after the individual's date of birth. So we have another 50 years to wait to see who Ted Bundy's true father really was. This happens because women who had children out of wedlock during that time, like Louise Bundy, dealt with the social stigma. In Vermont, access to closed adoption records is provided only by a court order. Eleanor Louise Kyle rarely talked about who her son's father was. His father's identity was unknown to Theodore throughout his life. His mother gives 2 different stories to the world of the paternity of her first child. This requires going down a small rabbit hole. The first one is Lloyd Marshall. There have been many theories about the identity of his father, including when he learned he was illegitimate. Anne Rule, an author and former co-worker of Ted Bundy, would write a book about her experiences with him. The book is called The Stranger Beside Me, and it said that L. Marshall was his father without revealing any pertinent personal details about the man. Theodore's mother was in the Roxborough, Manayuk neighborhood in Pennsylvania for most of her early adult life, at least from ages 15 to her early 20s. She consistently handed out a mixed bag of details regarding the identity of her son's father, but some details stayed the same. The name on Theodore's birth certificate, which she never directly told anyone, was only discovered by Theodore himself after he visited Elizabeth Lund as an adult. But remember, I told you that Ted's birth certificate at the Elizabeth Lund home would have been altered. And so did he get a court order, or did he just look at the birth certificate that they showed him at the Elizabeth Lund home? Later relaying these details to Anne Rule, his friend. You see, Anne Rule and Ted Bundy met in 1971 while working together at a crisis center in Seattle. Bundy was a psychology student at the University of Washington, and Rule was a former police officer who became a crime writer. They became close friends, sharing meals and conversation. Who is L. Marshall or Lloyd Marshall? In 1930, he and Louise lived within 30 minutes of each other. From 1940 to 1950, Marshall lived less than 10 minutes from Louise Kyle. It is believed they would have run into each other at some point, especially both being teenagers and spending most of their young adult lives in close proximity. He served as a sailor in the Navy for 3 years until he was discharged and returned home in January of 1946. Remember, Ted was born in November of 1946. Marshall was married in September of 1946, which showed a clear need for discretion, seeing that he didn't want his wife to know that he was sleeping around with young old Louise. Louise said that Theodore's father took her to a doctor who gave her abortion pills, but nothing happened. But here's the problem with that. The first abortion pill wasn't created till the 1980s, so what pill did Louise really take? But I told you there were two stories about Ted Bundy's father. Number two, Louise claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant. Census record revealed that several men by the name of Jack Worthington and Lord Marshall lived near Louise Bundy when she conceived. Louise said that Ted was the product of her brief fling with this mysterious World War II veteran after graduating from high school in 1946. They split up when Louise was 7 months pregnant. Could it be that Louise slept with both men and she didn't know who the father was, which is why there's two stories about Ted's father? The name L. Marshall only ever comes up from Ted Bundy's own account to Anne Rule. So why should we care that Theodore was an illegitimate child? Because this is one of the major reasons why Ted Bundy resented his own mother and ultimately became a serial killer and hated women. Bundy's former girlfriend would share with a psychiatrist that Bundy subsequently resented his mother because he felt he had been humiliated by her. He had mommy issues. Also, many people speculated that Ted Bundy's father was really his grandfather. Some family members expressed suspicions that Theodore was conceived by Louise's own father. A childhood friend would later admit that Ted Bundy told him that Louise was sexually assaulted. In 1987, Ted told attorneys that Samuel was a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and dogs, swung neighborhood cats by the tail. He abused animals like any psychopath would. I honestly believe Ted's wickedness could have came from his grandfather. Samuel reportedly threw Julia, his youngest daughter, down a flight of stairs for oversleeping, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Ted's paternity was raised. Ted could have learned how to be a monster from his grandfather, for we only repeat what we see. His grandfather was a very violent, and it is very likely that Theodore watched his grandfather abuse the women in his house. Samuel Kyle also kept pornographic material around the house. Is there any wonder where Theodore got his violent, sadistic, and perverse nature from? His grandfather kept detective magazines around the house. Those detective magazines portrayed women being bound and assaulted. Seeing anger and violence at an early age can distort a child's beliefs. Ted would tell his childhood friend that his grandfather enjoyed beating him. Ted Bundy also stuttered as a child, and it is believed that Ted Bundy's speech impediment came from the fact that his grandfather beat him so severely. His grandfather would repeatedly put him down and called him regularly a bastard. His grandfather, Samuel, never admitted that he was his father, but Ted told his childhood friend, Doug, that his mother told him that she was sexually assaulted. Personally, I do believe that Louise Bundy was raped by her father. This is why she has several different explanations of who Ted Bundy's father was. Also, Ted Bundy was a true narcissist and always portrayed himself in the best light in public. He absolutely would not want the world to know that he was the product of incest. So he told the world that his father was Lloyd Marshall. This description of Bundy's grandfather has been questioned in more recent investigations. Some locals in Roxborough remember Samuel as a fine man and expressed bewilderment at the reports of him being violent. The idea that Sam was a raging alcoholic and animal abuser was a convenient characterization used to make people justify why Theodore was the way he was. Bundy's cousins said, from my limited exposure, they said, nothing was farther from the truth. His daughters loved him dearly and had nothing but fond memories of him. Who knows what goes on behind closed doors? Even Bundy's friends, after he was captured, said they didn't think he was a violent man, because you never truly know who you're dealing with or what they are thinking. If you were an abuser, would you tell your friends you were an abuser? Let me know what you think in the comments. Eleanor Miriam Longstreet dealt with severe depression and was institutionalized. She also had electric shock therapy, so Theodore has mental illness from his grandfather and mental illness from his grandmother. Young Theodore occasionally exhibited disturbing behavior at an early age. Louise's younger sister, Julia Cow, recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen and her 3-year-old nephew, Theodore, standing by the bed, smiling at her. Creepy, don't you think? Remember, Ted is only 3 years old at this time. What is truly interesting about what happened to Theodore Robert Cow before age 3 is this. We will never be able to find out how he was treated at the Elizabeth Blunt Home for Unwed Mothers. After his mother, Louise, packed her bags and returned home without her boy, was he neglected or perhaps even abused? During that time, many orphanages, babies were even shaken or beaten when they started screaming or crying. This alone could lead to severe and lasting head trauma in infants. Louise had left her son Theodore at the home the first 3 months of his life, so odds were already stacked against Theodore. It is unknown whether Louise herself struggled with mental illness challenges throughout her life, but both grandparents suffered from mental health issues. His grandmother, Eleanor, had been diagnosed as a psychotic depressive, which would translate to bipolar, possibly schizophrenia in modern times. She was an agoraphobic, which means she never went outside, and was frequently hospitalized for mood disorder. And Theodore's grandfather, Samuel, was not only known as a bad-tempered, physically abusive toward his family as well as neighborhood pets, but he at times screamed at the air as if he was having a verbal altercation with someone only he could see. And with 2 grandparents displaying signs of psychotic conditions and one grandparent clearly struggling with impulse control and anger management, Bundy would have required even more nurturing in order to combat unfortunate predisposition. What is observed in serial killers is that in almost all instances they share the following traits: psychiatric illness or predisposition through medical history or family history, childhood trauma like neglect and abuse, head trauma, and like being hit upside the head by your grandfather, which would result in deviant behavior, fantasies. All 3 were in Theodore Cow's upbringing. In order to understand some individuals, sometimes you need to go all the way back to the beginning. For the first 3 years of Ted Bundy's life, he lived with his grandparents, and he thought that they were his parents. At the age of 4, Theodore and his mother, whom he thought was his older sister, moved to Tacoma, Washington, to live with relatives. In 1950, Louise Cow changed her surname from Cow to Nelson. Now, why would a loving daughter want to change her surname? Clearly, she resented some aspect of her parents for which she never mentioned. I believe she changed her surname because she didn't want anything to do with her father. At the urging of multiple family members, she left Philadelphia with Ted to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott. While Ted Bundy was in Washington, he began removing dismembered pictures of women from crime novels. It is very troubling to understand that Ted Bundy was exposed to sex at a very early age. The fascination with sex at an early age usually comes from children who have been abused. It can cause you to be promiscuous and be obsessed with sex. In Tacoma, Washington in 1951, Louise Bundy met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who was a hospital cook. She met him at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They fell in love, and she marries Mr. Bundy May 19, 1951. Ted was later adopted by him and took his stepfather's last name, which he would keep for the rest of his life. Theodore Robert became Ted Bundy. Over the years, the Bundy family added 4 other siblings whom Ted spent much of his time babysitting after school. And when Ted was finally captured after his crimes, he told one thing about his younger sister. He told authorities that he molested his younger sister. Ted's stepfather also tried to form a bond between himself and Ted by including him in camping trips and other father-son activities. However, Johnny's attempts were unsuccessful and Ted remained emotionally detached from his stepfather. Ted was a loner and he enjoyed being alone. Stories about his childhood in Tacoma would change in later years. He described roaming his neighborhoods, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women. He said that he perused detective magazines and crime novels for stories that involved sexual violence, and particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead and maimed women. He would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else he could see. Psychologist Al Carlisle, who examined Ted Bundy later, claimed that Bundy started fantasizing about women he saw while window peeping or elsewhere. He was fantasizing about being someone else, someone important. Bundy's childhood Tacoma neighbor Sandy Holt described him as a bully, a mean-spirited kid. He liked to terrify people. Holt later said he liked to be in charge. He liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. She also alleged that Bundy engaged in animal cruelty, another great sign of a psychopath. He was a sadist. He hung one stray cat in the neighborhood from the clothesline by its tail. Then he doused it in lighter fluid and set the poor animal on fire. "I heard that cat squealing," she said. Bundy would take young girls in the neighborhood into the woods and terrorize them. He'd take them out there, strip them down, take their clothes. Sandy added that Bundy built makeshift traps around his neighborhood, entering at least one girl. One little girl went over the top of one of Bundy's traps and got the whole side of her leg split open with the sharp point of the stick that she landed on. So to sum it all up, Ted Bundy was horrible from the very beginning. Now let me tell you a story. One of the families that settled in Tacoma, Washington, not far from where Ted and his mother lived, was the Burrs. The Burrs, Don and his wife Bev, were family-oriented. They spent as much time as they could with the children. They had 4 children, and Anne Marie was the eldest. Anne Marie was 8 years old, with blonde hair and hazel eyes, relaxed, confident, older than her years, a very pretty little girl. Though she was only 8 years old, she was comfortable around teenagers. Anne Marie had a crush on a 15-year-old neighbor named Robert Bruzos. Robert lived 2 doors away from the Burrs on the same side of the street. He came from a good family. His parents were both school teachers. Robert and Anne liked each other very much. They spent most of their time together. They would often playfully tease each other back and forth. She would call him lover boy, and he would call her my girl. Robert and Anne Marie were inseparable, but then on one rainy night on August 31st, 1961, a tragic event would change their lives forever. The doors to the Burrs house had been locked securely. At 8:00 p.m., Anne Marie and her sister Mary went to bed, but during the night, Mary woke up crying. You see, Mary had broken her arm. She had a cast on her arm. So Anne Marie went to her mother to let her know that Mary was crying. After her mother got the girls back to bed, later that night, Bev, the girl's mother, heard Mary crying again. So she went to the room to see about her daughter. That's when she noticed that Anne Marie was missing. As a result, she searched the house, and during the course of searching, was when she noticed that the front door was standing wide open and that the window in the living room was open as well. She then desperately went around to some of the neighbors' houses to ask if they had seen her daughter Anne Marie. Nobody had seen her. Beverly really felt from that moment on that Anne Marie was gone and that this was not going to turn out well. She instinctively knew that from that very moment she would never see her precious daughter ever again. Police arrived in only a few minutes, and that began the biggest missing child search in state history during that time. The search and rescue personnel were brought in to canvass the area. For several days, hundreds of volunteers, military personnel, law enforcement personnel searched. Dive teams searched Commencement Bay for signs of Anne Marie, but they found nothing. The front door of the house was wide open where Anne Marie allegedly walked or was carried out. Law enforcement noticed that table figurines beside the open living room window were undisturbed despite the appearance that someone had entered through the home that way. A faint footprint was found near the overturned bench that was up near the window of the house. Law enforcement estimated the shoe print that was made was a Ken sneaker size 6 or 7, most likely the size of a teenager. It was determined that Anne Marie left the residence only wearing a blue nightgown. Somebody had put a bench up to the window and opened the window in the living room. That was believed to have been the kidnapper's initial entry point. Some possible evidence was located at the point of entry. A red thread potentially came from the suspect's clothing when they came through the window. With few clues, the police began to build a list of suspects. They started with the family and they expanded outward. For those people that would be familiar with the family and the neighbors, and then so on and so forth. Police detectives had lists of hundreds of names that they checked. They polygraphed hundreds of people for the fact that there were no signs of struggle within the house. That laid credibility to the idea that Anne Marie knew her assailant and also that he might be nearby. One suspect they thought might be suspicious was Robert Brusos, a 15-year-old friend of Anne Marie. After hearing about the relationship, police located Robert. They went to his high school and pulled him out of class. Taking him down to the police station, they gave him a polygraph test. He failed that test. A few days later, they followed up with him again and gave him a second one. He passed the second one, which is why polygraph tests are not allowed in court cases. They are not an exact science in detecting a lie. Robert would say that he failed the first test because he was terrified of the police officers that first arrested him. They never eliminated Robert as a suspect, but police didn't have enough real evidence to hold him and they had to let him go. They continued to search for Anne Marie for months. Months passed and Burrs began to lose hope. Don and his wife Bev were hopeful that something would come to light. Even after they moved out of their home that they had when Anne Marie disappeared, they kept the same phone number though in hopes that maybe Anne Marie was still alive and so that she would be able to contact them by phone. But she never did. Anne Marie's body was never found. They never found a trace of her. The case had gone cold. Years passed by and the Burrs believed Anne Marie was gone forever. What police did not know and wouldn't find out for the next 20 years is this. In 1961, Ted Bundy was 15 years old, the same age as Robert Brusos, Anne's close friend. Could he have been friends with Robert? And did they live in the same neighborhood? Could Anne Marie and Ted have crossed paths? Remember, Anne Marie liked to hang out with teenagers. The truth is, Ted lived near Anne Marie. He and his mother, Louise, moved to Tacoma, Washington, and lived with her uncle, so they moved into her uncle's small house on North Adler Street, and they lived with him and his wife and his 2 kids. Even though Theodore lived a few blocks away, he had a paper route that took him through the neighborhoods. He was, at the time of the incident, 15 years old and in the 9th grade. at Hunt Middle School. There were many times when Anne Marie was out playing outside in front of her house and he would come by and would stop and they would talk. There would be some teasing, so most likely Ted convinced Anne Marie to leave her house on that fateful morning on August 31st, 1961, because she knew him. Also, there was no struggle in the house, so Anne Marie most likely walks outside the house, and that's when Ted Bundy took her. Now, dear old Ted was also friends with some of the kids who lived near the Burrs' house. And one of those friends was Doug Holt and his sister Sandy, who was a couple of years younger than Doug. The two boys were in the Cub Scouts together and they went on camping trips together. They played in the neighborhood together. They went out exploring and roaming around the neighborhood every day in the woods near their homes. But Sandy would keep her distance from Ted. Sandy would hold back some because she knew and watched what Ted Bundy was up to. A lot of the playtime with Doug was what we might think of as gruesome. Disturbingly enough, Ted's interests were in slicing open animals to see what they looked like on the inside. He would also light them on fire and torture the animals. Have you ever watched other crime shows or serial killers? You might notice a common denominator with psychopaths. 90% of them tend to mutilate and hurt animals. They don't view animals as living beings, but just something they can destroy. It appeals to their sadistic nature. The mutilation and killing of animals is a very strong predictor of antisocial, violent behavior because it shows a lack of empathy and a lack of connection. Ted Bundy would come up behind his so-called friends and scare them. It wasn't just that he jumped out of the bushes and said boo. Ted Bundy stalked his own friends. If the person has no appreciation for other people's rights or feelings, it can be viewed as problematic. Young Sandy would later state that Ted Bundy would drag girls into the woods and urinate on them, and her brother Doug protected her from that. You don't have to go that far, Ted, Doug would say. Ted would also turn very violent very quickly if you talked about his daddy's issues or the lack that he didn't have one. During this time in history, to be born out of wedlock was forbidden. You were considered a bastard. Boys also tend to get their identity from their fathers. The fact that Ted didn't have one was very troubling to him. But anger wasn't the only problem that he had. The neighborhood started reporting a lot of peeping Toms looking through windows. Ted started stalking at a very young age. He didn't start stalking when he became an adult. It started in his teenage years, so by the time he was an adult, he was very proficient at it. Ted Bundy would follow young girls and women and look at them through their windows as a teenager. One time it is said that Ted followed a woman, and as she was walking up to her door, he had a log in his hand and he hit the woman in the head with the log and ran away. I think he just got a thrill out of it. Young Ted wanted to see what it felt like to hurt somebody. Now with the conduct of a peeping Tom and stalking, Ted is exhibiting antisocial conduct. As time passed by, Ted began to take a special interest in Anne Marie. He talked in depth about it when he was finally captured, how this other self started to present itself in him. One of the most interesting things he said was that something happened to him when he was around 14 or 15. I believe the thing that happened to Ted Bundy is that he committed his first murder. In school, Ted Bundy was terribly shy, self-doubting, and uncomfortable in social situations. He was seen as socially awkward and had the tendency to stutter when he spoke. He was often teased by bullies in his junior high school. Bundy had a lot of trouble making friends and struggled to make any kind of connection with other people. Also, he never dated or talked to any other girls in school. He only ever dated when the girls approached him. He had difficulty making close, intimate relationships. By age 15, he was very familiar with pornography that was introduced to him by his grandfather. According to journalists Hugh Ainsworth and Stephen Mashad, who documented conversations with Bundy while he was in jail, called Conversations with a Killer, Ted became increasingly uncomfortable around his stepfather and preferred to be alone. This desire to be by himself increased and possibly led to his later inability to socially interact comfortably with others. Ted's behavior shows he was not like other children. He looked like them, but something haunted young Ted Bundy. He felt it for years, but he didn't recognize it for what it was until later. Regardless of the humiliating experiences he sometimes suffered from being different, he was able to maintain a high grade point average in school that would continue through high school and into college. Ted also claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop friendships. I didn't know would make people want to be friends, Bundy claims, so people perceive me as being shy or introverted. He said, I didn't go to dances. I didn't go on beer runs with my friends. Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School said Bundy was well known and well liked by then. His only significant athletic interest was downhill skiing, which he pursued enthusiastically with stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, Bundy was arrested at least 2 times on a suspicion of burglary and a motor vehicle theft. At age 18, the details of these incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington State and other states. During his high school years, his popularity increased, and he was considered to be well-dressed and exceptionally well-mannered. Despite his emerging popularity, he stated his interests lay more in extracurricular activities such as skiing and politics. In fact, he had a particular fascination with politics, an interest that would land him in the political arena. In the spring of 1965, Ted graduates from Woodrow Wilson High School in Tacoma, Washington. Following high school in September of 1965, he attended college at the University of Puget Sound until 1966, the same college where his mother worked. In the fall of 1966 to the spring of 1969, he transferred to the University of Washington to study Chinese. On June 23, 1965, the apartment of Lonnie Trumbull and Lisa Wick was broken into. There is very little information about Lonnie Trumbull, other than she was born on April 4, 1946 in Seattle, Washington. She was only 20 years old. She had recently graduated from flight attendant school. Lonnie lived there with 2 other flight attendants at the time of her murder. These few facts are all that remain of a life taken far too soon. On June 23, Lonnie Trumbull and her roommate Lisa Wick were attacked in their apartment. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 23rd, Lonnie and Lisa were beaten with a piece of wood while they slept in their beds. The time is speculated to be around midnight, based on the last known contact with either of the women. A neighbor saw a car speeding away from the apartment at 12:15 a.m. The scene lay undisturbed until another roommate, who had been away from the apartment for that night, returned home. In the early morning hours, she found the door suspiciously unlocked and the lights left on, which made her hesitate outside of the apartment door and called out for her roommates. When she was met with only silence, as she entered the apartment, she found the bloody scene where Lonnie and Lisa's pillows were drenched with blood, and the walls near their heads were splattered as well. Understandably terrified, the woman ran from the apartment and sought the help of her landlord. The landlord then called the police to report the incident. Upon examination of the crime scene, the police found Lisa alive, but barely. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She ended up surviving. Unfortunately, Lonnie was dead upon arrival. Lonnie's autopsy and the examination of Lisa showed that neither woman had been sexually assaulted. The investigation of the scene yielded few clues. There were no signs of forced entry, so either the door had been left unlocked or the door was flimsy enough to pick without leaving any evidence behind. The murder weapon, a 1.5 long piece of wood stained with blood, was found in a vacant lot nearby. It was found alongside a girdle that belonged to one of the women, linking it to the crime scene. A flight attendant's bag was stashed nearby in the lot as well. Nothing else was apparently missing from the apartment. Ted just had a bloodlust and wanted to kill somebody. Police thought the perpetrator was someone both of the women knew, based on the level of brutality that was left at the crime scene. With this theory in mind, police officers started seeking out suspects, questioning nearly 100 people who knew Lonnie and Lisa, polygraphing more than a few. They followed tips to dead ends, and suspects were cleared by alibi or by passing a polygraph. And as Lisa recovered from her injuries, the memory of that night came back. She worked with police to sketch the suspect. The sketch resulted in no substantial leads. Ted Bundy wasn't even considered as a suspect until much later, when Detective Robert Capel suspected Bundy because of later crime. Bundy was 19 years old at the time of the attack and living with his parents in Tacoma, Washington. Now, being 19 would give Ted Bundy the physical strength and stamina to commit these crimes. In 1967, Ted Bundy became romantically involved with a University of Washington classmate. Ted met a girl named Diane Marjorie Jean Edwards, also known as Stephanie Brooks. She was his first girlfriend, who was originally from Burlingame, California. She was everything he ever wanted or dreamed of. She was beautiful, highly sophisticated, and wealthy woman from a family in California. Ted couldn't believe someone of her stature would have an interest in him. She was beautiful, smart, outgoing, and a part-time model. Everything that Ted Bundy could possibly ask for. Although they had many differences, they both loved to ski, and it was during these ski trips together that they fell for one another. She was really Ted Bundy's first love and possibly the first woman he was ever sexually involved with. However, she was not as infatuated as he was with her. She ultimately only wanted to be friends. In fact, she liked Ted very much, but he had no direction or ambition or any future goals. Bundy tried too hard to impress her, even if that meant lying, which she didn't like at all. Ted described Edwards as the only woman he ever truly loved. Stephanie Edwards graduated in the spring of 1968 and left Washington State for San Francisco. Bundy visited her later that year and had even got a summer scholarship to study Chinese at the prestigious Stanford University just to impress her. But at Stanford, his immaturity was exposed. By this time, his girlfriend had had enough of Ted Bundy. Diane described Bundy as not strong. He wasn't real masculine. If I got mad at him, she said, he would suddenly be all apologetic. He wouldn't stand up for himself. She also stated he would often lie to her. Stephanie felt that there was something not quite right with Ted Bundy. He would just pop up in weird places like he was following her, and I'm sure he was. She broke up with Ted. She was a practical woman and seemed to realize that Ted Bundy had some serious character flaws that took him out of the running as a future husband material. She described him as being pitifully weak and even cried when she broke up with him. Stephanie Edwards returns to her family home in California, frustrated by what she described as Ted's immaturity and lack of ambition. Ted Bundy never recovered from this breakup. Nothing, including school, seemed to hold his interest anymore. He eventually dropped out, dumbfounded and depressed over the breakup. He managed to stay in touch with her by writing her when she returned to California, yet she seemed uninterested in getting back together with Ted Bundy. But Ted became obsessed with this young woman. He couldn't get her off his mind. It was an obsession that would span his lifetime and lead to a series of events that would shock the world. It is quite possible that Ted Bundy started murdering because of the breakup of his one true love, Diane Edwards. A little later, Ted embarks on a political career. Ted liked politics because politicians are all about selling an image. It doesn't have to be real, it's just portraying an image. That appealed to Ted Bundy. In early 1968, Ted dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller presidential campaign. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, sometimes referred to by his nickname Rocky, was an American businessman and politician. He served as the 41st Vice President of the United States from 1974 to 1977 under President Gerald Ford. Ted also became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for Lieutenant Governor of Washington State. In August, Ted Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. And in 1969, Ted met a woman by the name of Liz Kendall, also known as Elizabeth Clover, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Bundy also became a father figure to Liz's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old at the time when they started dating. Bundy stayed in the young girl's life until she was about 10 years old. Also, Molly wrote of instances at age 7 when Bundy was abusive and sexually inappropriate with her. Her accounts include Bundy hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her at risk of drowning, indecent exposure, and incidents of touching disguised as accidents or games. In the mid-1970s, Bundy's now focused and goal-oriented enrolled in the University of Washington, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor roll student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, and there he met his longtime friend Ann Rule, a former police officer and aspiring crime writer, and she wrote one of the definitive Bundy biographies titled The Stranger Beside Me. Ann Rule saw nothing disturbing about Ted Bundy's personality at the time. She described him as a kind and empathetic. After graduating from the University of Washington in 1972, Ted Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he spied on his opponent, Albert Rossellini, and recorded and copied his speeches for analysis by the Evans team. Evans subsequently appointed Ted to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. Stalking the politician would prove critical later in life. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Ted was accepted into the law school at the University of Utah on the strength of letters and recommendations from the governor and several psychology professors. During a trip to California for Republican Party business, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Diane Edwards. At this time, Bundy was also dating girlfriend Liz. Invigorated and happy at how his life was progressing, he seemed to have everything he wanted. Diane marveled at his transformation into a serious and dedicated professional on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. But neither woman was aware of each other. During 1973, Bundy is in the normal process of certain academic requirements at law school and continued courting Diane, who flew to Seattle, Washington several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage at one point. He introduced her to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, as his fiancée. But behind the facade of courting Diane was a carefully constructed plan. He had never forgiven her for ending their relationship, and despite winning her back and planning a future together, Bundy abruptly broke things off in early January 1974. Bundy broke off all communication with Diane. Her phone calls and letters went unanswered. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, she demanded to know why he had ghosted her and ended their relationship without an explanation. And in a flat tone, Bundy replied, "Why, Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up the phone. She never heard from him again. He later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself I could have married her." Diane Edwards concluded, in retrospect, the high-powered courtship in late 1973 was deliberately a plan of revenge, that he had waited all those years to be in a position to dump her, and as she had rejected him. This just proves how vindictive Ted Bundy truly is. Unknowingly, Miss Edwards had dodged a bullet. By then, Ted had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely, as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. By this time, Bundy had been stalking and attacking women as part of a carefully orchestrated plan. All of his actions up to early January had been an escalation towards something sinister. Liz was born in 1946. She was the same age as Ted Bundy. At that time, they were both 24 years old, but her encounter with Ted Bundy is a little different. Liz would date Ted Bundy for 6 years. Out of all the women that encountered Ted Bundy, she was one of the rare ones that lived. She definitely wanted to be married and loved and have a father for her daughter Molly, who was only 3 years old at the time. She found a job as a secretary at the University of Washington Medical School. One night, her friend suggested that she get a babysitter and come out for drinks at a local bar. It was something she never did, given that she was scraping by financially. During that evening, trying to escape a creepy guy in the bar, when she saw Ted Bundy sitting by himself. She approached him thinking he looked so sad. She said to him, "You look like your best friend just died." The two began to talk. Conversation flowed naturally. The chemistry was instant. Bundy ended up spending a platonic night at her house. I wonder why he didn't kill her. Most likely because she had a daughter on the premises. And also she went out with her friend that evening and he would have been the prime suspect. Or maybe she just brought a little normalcy into his life. But whatever the reason, he didn't kill her that night or any night after that. Shortly thereafter, Liz and Ted became a couple. Liz said, "I handed Ted my life and said, 'Here, take care of me.' He did in a lot of ways. When she felt his love, she was on top of the world. And when she felt nothing from Ted, she felt like nothing." She spoke in length about her life with Ted Bundy in a book called The Phantom Prince, detailing her 6-year turbulent relationship with the infamous man. Despite having a volatile relationship, Bundy and Liz talked about getting married. His feelings toward her were strong but inconsistent. She said we would be getting along fine, and then all of a sudden he would slam the door and I would be out in the cold until he let me back in again. I spent hours trying to figure out what I did wrong. Then suddenly he would be warm and loving again. In February of 1970, after Liz told Ted that she wanted to call him her husband instead of her boyfriend, they went to a courthouse, borrowed $5 from a friend, and got a marriage license. A few days later, before Liz's parents arrived in Seattle for a visit, she asked him to move his stuff out of her apartment, fearing it would upset or hurt her conservative parents. Bundy became enraged, and she recalls him saying, "If you're that hung up with what your parents think, you're not ready to get married." He tore up the license in pieces and walked out. During the fall of 1973, women in the Pacific Northwest started to disappear. At first, the cases seemed random, but soon a pattern emerged. The missing women were all beautiful, young academics in the prime of their lives. Families held out for the best, but when remains started to be discovered, authorities knew they had a serial killer on their hands. Missing in intervals of every 30 days, and they would vanish without a trace. All the women had one thing in common. They all had long hair that was parted in the middle. It first started in Washington State. Young Kathy Mary Devine was born on Christmas Day in 1959 to William and Sally Ann Devine of Seattle, Washington. Kathy was the middle child, and there is a 12-year gap between her and Charlene, her younger sister. Sherry, the eldest, is just a year older than Catherine. Her parents at some point divorced. Then in the fall of 1973, 14-year-old Kathy Devine was struggling. She had recently ended things with her boyfriend and was beginning to dabble in substance abuse. Talking to Charlene, her younger sister, about it, her drug use wasn't anything extreme. It sounded like normal teenage fun, especially in the 1970s. Described by those that loved her as a sweet and kind person, Catherine loved poetry and liked to line the walls of her bedroom with poems. Then on Sunday after Thanksgiving on November 25, 1973, Kathy disappeared while hitchhiking near her Seattle residence after getting into an argument with her mother about dating. Before leaving, she wrote her mother. She wrote her a note explaining that she needed to escape and was coming back again, that she was going to Rockaway Beach to visit her cousins. She ended it by, "P.S. Mom, I'll be back." She was seen by two of her girlfriends later that day, getting into the back of a pickup truck, driven by an unknown male. Investigators strongly theorized that she walked roughly 1/4 of a mile and took off from there. Investigators discovered that the man in the truck dropped her off at Restover Truck Stop near Tumwater, and it was there that she met the man that killed her. Kathy's parents reported her as missing to the police after she failed to return home. Miss Devine said her daughter was beautiful inside and out, and she was a normal, troubled teenager. At the time of her murder, Kathy Devine was a sophomore at Ingram High School, and like so many of Bundy's victims, she was beautiful, tall, weighing 120 pounds, and standing 5'8". She had startling blue-gray eyes and light brown hair that was midway down her back. Kathy's body was found near Olympia, Washington, on December 6, 1973. Her pants were cut off of her, and her throat was cut. Kathy was last seen approximately at 1:30 p.m. on November 25, 1973. The victim was found at Camp Margaret McKinney State Park 11 days after her abduction. Her body was found in some brush. Her face and the front of her neck, her tongue and her chest, and her vital organs had all been devoured by rodents. Her blouse and bra were pushed up over her breasts, and her blue jeans were not snapped and pulled down to her ankles, and her arms were tied behind her back. Next, it would be Karen Sparks, often written as Joni Lenz. She was born in 1956. She is considered to be Ted Bundy's first victim on record, but Ted's behavior, we all know, she was not the first. She lived in an on-campus apartment with 3 male friends. In 1974, Karen visited Dante's with her then boyfriend and college friends. It was a slightly pricey and posh place, a sports bar popular with college jocks and those living in fraternities and sororities. Also, Dante's is a tavern that Ted Bundy also frequented, in which he may have seen Sparks and made the decision to target her. On the night of January 4, 1974, 18-year-old Karen Sparks was in her basement apartment in Seattle, Washington, thinking herself to be safe. The political science student was reading in her bedroom at the campus home she shared with 3 male friends. At around 1 a.m., she glanced and saw a man watching her through her bedroom window. She ignored it, hoping it was just a figment of her imagination. It wasn't. After she fell asleep, Ted Bundy broke into her basement bedroom window. While she slept, he savagely bludgeoned her with a crowbar. The next morning, Karen was found surrounded by a pool of blood. A bed rod had been torn from her headboard, and in a sexual frenzy was rammed into her. Her bladder was literally split open. She shared something noticeable with almost all of Ted's victims. She wore her hair long and parted in the middle. Karen lay unconscious in the hospital for 10 days. After the attack, when she woke up, she had no memory of it. Many years later, Karen talked about that fateful night. She said, "I remember seeing some guy looking at me, and I thought, gosh, maybe it's just a figment of my imagination, because it was so quick." She recalled it was just a flash, and I thought, well, nobody's going to hurt me while I'm living with 3 guys. During the attack, her roommate started snoring, and her attacker heard the roommate snoring and got spooked and ran off. Karen's roommate Scott had just saved her life, and he didn't even know it. Sparks was unconscious and bleeding in the bed for 20 hours until about 7 p.m. that night, when her roommate Bob came down to check on her. Bob was horrified when he saw the blood and called 911 right away. Then he called her mother and he told her, "Oh, I think Karen must have fallen down the stairs. It's bad." When she had reached the hospital, her friends and her family found out how serious it really was, that she had suffered a horrific incident. When she finally woke up, her father and her roommate Bob were sitting there by her bed. I asked my dad, "What happened? What happened to me?" And he said, "Oh, you just bumped your head." As far as I remember, Karen said, my dad just tried to keep it as upbeat as possible. She later learned the horrific truth, but had no memory of the attack. She wasn't able to give investigators any clues about who had assaulted her. The brutal attack left her with permanent brain damage, also with a significant loss of her vision and her hearing. She had a horrible ringing in her ears from the attack, and also suffered from epileptic fits. Later, Karen says she remembers seeing an older man at a nearby laundromat staring at her, and when she looked at him, he would look away. And she said she owed her survival to her roommate that saved her life. Karen said investigators were kind of clueless at the time, but her father believed from the very beginning that her attacker had done this before, that he figured it out after Bundy's next victim. Her father continued to collect newspaper clippings on other missing women as Bundy's terrifying reign continued throughout the Northwest. The beautiful Linda Ann Healy was born on July 3, 1952. Tall, slender, beautiful girl with long dark hair and blue eyes. She was a very accomplished young woman at age 21. Her morning radio listeners anticipated their ski forecast from Linda Ann Healy. They heard her announce the ski conditions for the major ski areas in western Washington. She was a product of a good family, an upper middle class environment. She was also an excellent singer and a senior at the University of Washington. Majoring in psychology, she loved working with children who were mentally handicapped. Now, Linda shared the house with 4 other young women. On January 31st, 1974, her day was spent with normal classes and activities, and at one point she wrote her last letter to a good friend mentioning that the dinner she was making for her parents who were coming to visit her. On the following day, she and a few friends went for beers at Dante's Tavern. They didn't stay long, and Linda went home to watch television and talked on the phone with her boyfriend. Linda then went to bed. The roommate in the next room next to Linda heard no noises, none at all, coming from Linda's room that night. Linda had to get up early in the morning at 5:30 like clockwork to go to her job at the radio station. Her alarm went off and the girl in the next room awoke to hearing it, and then dozed off and went back to sleep. Then at 6 a.m. when that roommate's alarm went off, she could still hear Linda's alarm going off. It was still blaring. She went in and turned it off, noticing the bed was immaculately made. She heard the phone ring, and it was the radio station calling to see where Linda was. In her room, her bed was made up. Nothing looked disturbed, so the roommate assumed that Linda was already on her way to work. Later that evening, her parents showed up for dinner, and she never made it back home. And they knew then that something was terribly wrong. Nobody had seen her. She seemed to have vanished from the house. Linda's parents called the police. 2 detectives arrived, and when they examined Linda's room, they discovered that the pillow and the sheet underneath the bedspread were blood-stained. The blood had soaked through the mattress, and there was enough of it to determine that Linda must have been seriously injured. When she was abducted, upon investigation, the police pulled back the bed covers and found a heavy stained pillowcase and blood-soaked sheet in Linda's bed. Linda's roommate noticed that her bed was carefully made up. In fact, Linda was not normally one to make up her bed. The top sheet were missing on this carefully made up bed. Her nightgown was found stuffed in her closet, with the neckline crusted with dry blood. The clothes she wore that day were missing, and so was her backpack. Not one trace of the attacker or her body could be found. The intruder somehow had gotten into the house, removed her nightgown, again stuffed it in the closet, dressed her in a change of clothes, made up her bed, wrapped Linda in the top sheet, and carried her outside the house very quietly. Later, when Ted Bundy finally confessed to the murder of Linda Ann Healy from her basement bedroom in Seattle on February 1st, 1974, Ted Bundy broke into Linda Healy's apartment. He said he found the front doors open, bashed her in the head, and carried her to the back seat of his car. He covered her with something, then drove her to a secluded location. That it was one of his first abductions of that kind. The blood came from Ted bashing her skull with a crowbar while she was still sleeping. Beating her unconscious, he dressed her and carried her away. Bundy would later confess that he drove her to a secluded area where he sexually assaulted her and murdered her and dumped her body. Then on March 1st, 1975, Linda's skull and mandible, that's the part of the jawbone, was discovered on Taylor Mountain, west of Seattle. When the police started suspecting Ted Bundy in 1975, they found out that he had lived very close to Linda Ann Healy in 1974, and that both Linda and Ted Bundy had cashed checks at the same grocery store on the day she disappeared, so most likely he followed her to her home to see where she lived. Born in Olympia, Washington on June 9, 1954, Donna was a student at Evergreen State. She was an only child. Donna's parents described her as being somewhat shy and hesitant to open up. She earned good grades in school and was working towards an English degree. On March 12, 1974, Donna was last seen at 7 o'clock p.m. by a college roommate who Manson told she was going to attend a jazz concert being held on the campus. She was reportedly last seen between the dorms and the library on the way to the concert. Manson hadn't planned to leave campus, and supposedly all of her personal belongings were still in her room. She was reportedly depressed and possibly suicidal at the time of her disappearance. A close friend of Donna named Megan Ellis reported her missing to the police. She said Donna was not sure about school, if she wanted to stay in school or drop out. She wasn't happy with the circumstances or with the faculty. She was angry at the whole thing, but wasn't planning to do that until next year or the summer. She was never seen again. When detectives were alerted to her disappearance, they described her as 5 feet tall, 100 pounds, wearing on the day of her disappearance blue slacks, an orange and red and green striped shirt. Later, Bundy confessed to FBI agent Bill Hagmeyer, speaking in the third person, that the killer had met Donna Manson at a local tavern and said the two went back to his apartment where they drank alcohol and had consensual sex. Not that I believe that. When she fell asleep, he suggested the killer bludgeoned her with a crowbar before strangling her and then having sex with her corpse. She was then decapitated. He confessed to keeping as many as 4 or 5 heads at home with him at the same time, his trophies. He also admitted to using the hacksaw to remove the victim's hands, which he also carried around with him for several days in a bag. Authorities speculated that these were Bundy's trophies, that by carrying them around with him, he felt a sense of power. Because of the risk he was taking of being caught, he took her body and dumped it again on Taylor Mountain, one of his known burial sites, one of several dumping sites where most of his victims' remains were later found. Bundy later confessed about returning to the site to engage in necrophilia. Ted claimed he finally took Donna's skull to his girlfriend Liz's house and burned it in the fireplace down to the last ash. In a fit of paranoia and cleanliness, during the night of her murder, there had been signs of Bundy around the campus, including his yellow Volkswagen. But on August 29th of 1979, 2 fishermen came upon another human skull while walking in the foothills of Mount Rainier, southwest of Edenville. Searchers combed the area and located more human bones, hair, and a multicolored shirt, the same one she was wearing when she disappeared. They thought it was a piece of evidence because Donna was described as wearing this shirt that they found. The remains of Donna Manson have never been positively identified. However, there is speculation that the partial remains of an unidentified female discovered near Eatonville, Washington on August 29, 1978 might have belonged to her. Then on May 10, 1985, clothing and remains from the Bundy case were reportedly destroyed before a positive forensic identification could be made. Although Donna Manson remains one of Bundy's confirmed victims, he would never face charges for this young woman who had her life taken away by a monstrous serial killer who, like many of his victims, Donna Manson continues to remain lost but never forgotten. There were several witnesses who saw these women during the hours before they vanished, and there was never any reason to suspect that the 2 cases were connected to a single perpetrator. This all changed on April of 1974, when several women came forward to report how they were approached by a man wearing his arm in a sling who was asking for help. The first incident happened on April 12th, Good Friday, when a sorority girl was accosted outside the campus library at Central Washington State University in Ellensburg, Washington, by a man with his arm in a sling and a metal brace on his finger. She later told detectives that he appeared to be having trouble. The young woman offered her assistance and escorted the man to his Volkswagen Beetle that was parked 300 yards away. When they arrived at his vehicle, the woman noticed something bizarre. The front passenger seat was missing. The two chatted for several minutes about how the young man had injured his arm skiing in Crystal Mountain. Although the man seemed friendly, the woman couldn't shake a sense of unease she felt about him. The missing seat in his Volkswagen, the urge to get away suddenly overcame her, and she placed his books on the roof of his car and ran away as fast as she could. She didn't know it, but her intuition had saved her life. Just 5 days later, another young woman would not be so lucky. Susan Elaine Rancourt, aged 19, was born on October 12, 1955, in Laconia, Washington. She was 5 foot 2 inches tall and 104 pounds. She was such a bubbly young girl with an inquisitive mind, who had her head always in a book. Susan graduated from high school in 1973. She was beautiful. She was so happy and excited to be going to college. She had a new boyfriend. Her father was Dale Rancourt and her mother was Vivian Elaine. They had 4 kids. Susan was the third. On April 17, 1974, she disappeared on Central Washington College in Ellensburg. Susan went to a meeting across campus for the next year's dorm monitors. The meeting was at 9:00 p.m. After that, Susan had plans to watch a German film with a friend. She never arrived. She was last seen around 10:30 p.m. walking across Central Washington College lawn. By 3 a.m., her roommate called the dorm manager because she had not returned, and this was reported to the campus police. A massive search was undertaken. The search involved around 150 volunteers who walked across Ellensburg, checking the college abandoned buildings, stores that covered a 2-mile radius of the city, but nothing was ever found. Her parents offered a reward of $1,000. That may not seem a lot of money nowadays, but back then in the 1970s, it was the equivalent of $8,000 today. Her father, Dale, said although police had no leads, they were certain that she had been abducted. Taking time off from his job at the Anchorage Telephone Utility Company, Rancourt helped with his daughter's search. Later, Susan's skull was found on March 3, 1975 in Issaquah, Washington, in a wooded area near Taylor Mountain. She was identified by dental records. Brenda Carol Ball was born on November 8, 1951, in Enumclaw, Washington. Daughter of Rosemary Annard and Dwayne K. Ball, she was free and a fun-loving spirit. She graduated from Mount Rainier High School and had recently taken classes at Highline Community College in Des Moines, Washington. Brenda stood 5 feet 3 and 112 pounds. She had lovely brown eyes. She was seen wearing blue jeans, a turtleneck top with long sleeves, a shirt-style jacket, and brown clog-like wedge-heeled shoes. Brenda decided on a night out on May 31st that continued into the early morning hours of June 1st, 1974. She had gone to the Flame Tavern alone. The Flame Tavern, located at 12803 Ambum Boulevard in Buren near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, a topless bar with a seedy reputation. The tavern was considered a rough place during the 1970s, and Ball was seen arriving alone. She watched the band play and stayed until the tavern closed. She told friends that day that she would try getting a ride to Sun Lakes Dry Falls State Park on the eastern side of the state to meet them there later. She stayed at the tavern until 2 a.m. After closing, she asked a band member for a ride, but he was going in the opposite direction. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. Her disappearance did not immediately raise alarm among her friends and roommates, mainly because of her adventurous nature and tendency to leave and take random trips, sometimes for days at a time without telling anyone. Not a good idea. Her roommates noticed that none of her clothes had been taken and started to grow concerned. They decided to contact her bank and see if there was any activity on her account. You could do that back then in the 70s. When they were told that there had been no activity, they decided to call her parents, who lived in Kent. When Rosemary Annard heard the news of her daughter being missing, she called the police and reported her missing some 16 days after she vanished. There was no further mention of Brenda Ball throughout 1974, and into the first few months of 1975, she had seemingly vanished without a trace. Then in March 1975, a discovery was made on Taylor Mountain by two Green River College forestry students who were searching in a thick wooded area when they came across human remains. A skull was found lying among the damp, moss-covered trees. When investigators arrived, a search of the area uncovered more remains. Some of the craniums and mandibles from 4 different people had been unearthed, along with various bone fragments and clumps of hair, girls' clothing, jewelry, and other evidence. Dental comparisons were made, and the skull found on the first day was confirmed as belonging to Brenda Ball. The other remains reportedly belonged to Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, and Kathleen Parks. All had suffered damage to their skulls, with Brenda Ball's skull showing evidence of a fracture from a blow to the head. Ted Bundy later told investigators while speaking in the third person in an attempt not to implicate himself in additional crimes, he claimed that on the evening of June 1st, 1974, the killer stumbled upon Brenda Ball by chance when she was looking for a ride from a bar. After taking her on a ride in his Volkswagen Beetle, Bundy said the two got chatting. He offered her the chance to go to a party, an invitation she accepted. When they arrived, Bundy seemingly offered an explanation why there was no party and said Ball reluctantly agreed to go inside due to her intoxication. They continued drinking, and which ultimately ended up with consensual sex. And however, he admitted the act itself did not gratify his desire for control, and he felt the need to possess her. After she passed out from alcohol, he then strangled her to death. If Ted Bundy is to be believed about the circumstances surrounding Brenda Ball's death, his version fails to explain the fracture of Brenda's skull after it was found on Taylor Mountain. It is more likely that Ted Bundy knocked out Brenda in the parking lot, then took her back to his place where he raped and killed her. Roberta Kathleen Parks was born on February 27, 1954 in Lakewood, Ohio. But she moved with her parents to California. She preferred to be called Kathy. She loved to study and wanted to be someone who worked with kids or be a physical therapist. She liked to help people. She was a student at Oregon State University. She enjoyed writing in her free time. She wanted to travel and explore the cultures of the world. She was only 20 years old and had a boyfriend who adored her and wanted to marry her, but she wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of commitment. A friend who spotted Kathy coming out of her room shortly after 11 o'clock p.m. learned she was about to grab a late-night dinner at the cafeteria. Lorraine Fargo, who stopped to talk to Kathy not far away from the dining hall, Fargo said that Kathy looked preoccupied and sad that night. Kathy and her father appeared to have a strained relationship. Her sister Sharon called from Nevada that night to let her know that her father has suffered a heart attack, but he is in stable condition and likely to recover, she said. So Kathy was pretty upset that night before running into Ted Bundy. Ted also mentioned to reporters about his crimes after his imprisonment, named Stephen Mashad and Hugh Ainsworth, that Kathy Parks had indeed been depressed and lonely or something. He later admitted to approaching her in the Memorial University Commons cafeteria. Bundy would later tell them that vulnerable people had a certain posture and movements about them, that they are inviting more abuse to come their way. Parks was kidnapped at 11:00 p.m. on May 6, 1974, while she was on her way from her dorm room to Sackett Hall on Oregon State University campus to get some ice cream a mere 350 yards away. Kathy went out on a walk, where Bundy, under the guise of a kind stranger lending an ear to a depressed girl, lured her to his car. He tied her up and drove her back to Washington to be killed. Bundy sexually assaulted her twice on the way. Ted transported the co-ed alive and took her all the way back to Taylor Mountain, his favorite spot, where he raped her again and then killed her. Her skull was later found on Taylor Mountain. Ted confessed to her murder shortly before his death. Kathy's remains were found on Manistee, Washington. Her cause of death couldn't be determined, but her case was deemed a homicide. If I continued, we would be here for another 2 hours. Join me next time for the conclusion of the life of Theodore Robert Bundy as he moves from state to state. This is Notorious Minds. Please like, share, and by all means subscribe to this channel. Have a good day. See you next time.